Welcome everyone. Today I'll be presenting two different pieces of literature. One, a poem by T.S. Eliot called The Wasteland, which was written in 1922, and the second one, a novel called The Wars, which is written by Timothy Finley in 1977. Both of these pieces present the devastation of World War I, not only through battle scenes, but also through the inner struggle of grief, morality, and identity. Eliot's The Wasteland presents a fragmented, disillusioned world where voices collide and traditions collapse and reflect the cultural trauma left after war, while Finley's The Wars, on the other hand, tells the story of Robert Ross, a young Canadian soldier whose personal battles with grief, duty, and compassion reveal how war fractures the human spirit. Together, these texts allow us to explore war not only as a historical event, but as a psychological and moral crisis. Now that we've introduced both texts, let's look how The Wasteland and The Wars can be compared on three main areas, which is the literary lenses, literary and poetic devices, and themes. Firstly, through a psychoanalytic lens, Eliot's fragmented voices, use of multiple speakers in different time periods and perspectives, immerses the reader into the environment of post-World War I and helps them picture emotional and psychological breakdown a society experiences after war. And at the same time, the use of this lens in the novel shows Robert's development of personal trauma and grief following after Rowena's death. And additionally, the use of this lens allows for a greater understanding of Robert's actions and what they mean symbolically, and together they both depict how the war affects the psyche of soldiers. From an archetypal perspective, we can see how Eliot uses myths like the Fisher King in his poem to mimic and symbolize the condition of Europe's civilization post-World War I as wounded and unable to heal. Furthermore, Eliot uses symbols like water to portray prosperity and hope for a better future. And when analyzing the wars through this lens, we can see how Finley uses animals as a symbol of innocence and represents his sister, and how fire is portrayed as destruction and also renewal by ending Robert's military service. Also, we can see how Robert's sister, Rowena, is portrayed as the enigma and his motivation, and how Captain Leather can be portrayed as a shadow which opposes Robert's morals. Together, these two pieces highlight the universal struggles of survival and compassion during the war. A feminist lens highlights gender roles in both texts. Eliot critiques broken relationships and patriarchal structures and depicts women as silenced and objectified, while males hold sexual and social power. For instance, in the scene The Typist and Clerk, we can see how a woman is raped and assaulted. In the novel, Finley shows how Robert is pressured to be a man and how the military urges him to be a masculine and dominant male, while his sister's passing shapes his guilt and morals, which leads him to not adhere to blind obedience. Secondly, literary and poetic devices. Both texts use fragmentation to mirror disorientation and chaos in war. Eliot does so through shifting voices and using free verse, while Finley uses fractured narrative by including archival documents and interviews and multiple perspectives such as his mother's life back at home. Altogether, these fragments mimic the psychological damage a soldier will experience during and after his service. Symbolism is also an important role in both The Wars and The Wasteland. Eliot's description of barren landscape symbolizes collapse of civilization after World War I and presents a sterile, dry, and meaningless world, while The Waters symbolizes the hope for renewal and a better future. Finley's use of animals and the photograph of Rowena and her rabbits both symbolize her innocence and compassion, which has been adopted by his brother in order to honor and preserve her innocence. Both works rely heavily on allusion. Eliot references mythology such as the Fisher King and Greek mythology like Philomela and Tiresias, who both symbolize suffering, which is an important theme in the poem, while Finley makes biblical references such as sacrifice and innocence, which are also important themes. For example, Robert's compassion and duty to protect the vulnerable is an example of sacrifice, and Rowen's and her bunnies can portray innocence. The novel also makes historical references by using archives and interviews, which makes the story seem more realistic and makes it seem as if the reader is a historian who is trying to reconstruct Robert's life by interviewing people. Finally, themes. Grief and loss are present in both texts. Eliot mourns the collapse of civilization and can be seen through the barren landscapes and the dry and sterile environment described by him, while Finley shows Robert's personal grief with the loss of his sister and his inability to preserve her innocence in the war. Morality versus duty is another shared theme. Eliot portrays society as lost and empty after the war, and shows characters performing acts that no longer have meaning or compassion. An example of this could be the typist and clerk scene, where Eliot describes the encounter as mechanical and joyless, and illustrates how intimacy has become stripped of love and reduced to an obligation, while on the other hand, the novel shows Robert resisting military orders when they conflict with his moral duty to protect innocence. These two pieces show a strong difference when analyzing the morality and duty between the two, while one shows meaning and the other one shows none. Identity and fragmentation are another important theme. Eliot's voices and use of multiple speakers reflect a fractured identity and show how traditions and values are erased from society because of the war. In the novel, we see how Robert's identity is altered and left in jeopardy when he is stuck in between his moral duty and his military duty, and shows us how violence reshapes a person's identity. To finish off, The Wasteland and the Wars confront war not just as a battlefield, but as a crisis of morality and identity and compassion. Eliot's fragmented voices mimics cultural collapse, while Finley's fractured narrative reveals personal trauma. And together these two pieces remind us that war dismantles both societies and individuals.